One of the very first things that we learn about 40K is that the Golden Throne, the device that keeps the God Emperor alive and holds back the tides of chaos, has slowly begun to fail. And when this finally happens, when it finally goes lights out, it's going to usher in an apocalyptic scenario, the likes of which the galaxy has never seen. It is a ticking clock, so to speak, an unavoidable doomsday scenario that adds a certain degree of hopelessness to the overall setting. But the thing that most people don't know is that within the Imperium of Man, this isn't exactly widespread information. Even those in the highest positions of authority have no idea what is really going on. Those that do know have sworn themselves to secrecy and have made plans to do some truly heretical, unforgivable things in order to repair it. The throne's failure was at the center of a massive conspiracy, one that stretched all the way to the top and involved some of mankind's most ancient enemies. And if that wasn't bad enough, what the Dark Eldar were planning on doing in order to capitalize on this is probably one of the most bonkers things I've read about in 40K in a long time. This was all detailed in the Vaults of Tera novel series, which, fair warning, I'm going to be spoiling pretty heavily throughout this video. And yes, I'm aware every lore video technically contains spoilers for dozens of books, but I figured I'd give you the heads up anyways. In this video, we're going to be talking about what the Golden Throne is and why it would be so catastrophic if it ever failed. We're going to be detailing the conspiracy designed to cover it up, as well as the investigative efforts of the inquisitors that uncovered it. We're also going to be talking about the Dark Eldar's involvement, how they promised humanity salvation in exchange for a terrible price. Not only that, but we're also going to be diving into their hidden agenda, the truly horrifying thing they were actually planning on doing, which may or may not include making a Dark Eldar version of the God Emperor. We're going to be diving into all that and a whole lot more in this video, as there's a lot to cover. But before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, no matter who you are, we've all got bad habits. Me, you, our friends and family, but the truth is, we don't need to have bad habits, as we can replace them with a good one. And listen, I know that's easier said than done. Bad habits are notoriously hard to break. But recently, that's gotten a whole lot easier with the sponsor of today's video, Fume, who are leading the way in flavored air devices. And trust me, I know what it looks like, but Fume isn't a vape. It doesn't produce any vapor or smoke, it doesn't have any batteries, there's no harmful chemicals or addictive substances. It's honestly ingeniously simple. It's got these cool little spongy cores that flavor the air as you breathe it in. Now, recently my favorite flavor has been the crisp mint, as I feel like it opens up my nose and it's just super refreshing. In addition to being a flavored air device, it's made to be fidgeted with. It's got a series of magnet snaps and clicks that are super satisfying. I mean, just listen to this. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Fume has served over 300,000 customers, and you can be their next success story. For a limited time, you can use my code WesHammer to get your free Fume base when you order the Journey Pack. It's the all-new magnetic stand for your Fume device. Head to tryfume.com, that's tryfum.com, and use code WesHammer or scan the QR code on the screen to get your free Fume base when you order your Journey Pack today. Big thanks to Fume for sponsoring this video. Okay, before we dive into all of the juicy lore tidbits that we get in the Vaults of Tera series, I think it's important that we take a minute to understand what the Golden Throne is and why the very notion that it could fail makes it the subject of such a huge conspiracy within the Imperium. I'm going to keep it brief and just focus on the important bits that you need to know, as there's enough lore on the throne that realistically it could warrant its own deep dive. So what exactly is the Golden Throne? In its simplest terms, it is a massive psychic amplification device the size of a city block that stretches miles underground and is located within the Imperial Palace. Although it's not literally a throne per se, it does have a chair-like interface that a powerful psyker can sit upon and interface with its ancient machinery. Or at least we think it does. The Golden Throne looks very different to every single person who witnesses it, much like the Emperor himself, but I'm getting sidetracked. That's a topic for a different video. Although the vast majority of humanity in the 41st millennium believes that it was the Emperor himself who created it, we as the audience know that this isn't the case. More likely, it was constructed during the Dark Age of technology, was found by the Emperor in the 29th or 30th millennium, and was relocated to the Imperial Palace to suit his own purpose. And what exactly was that purpose, you might be asking? Basically, to punch a hole in the Eldari webway, give humanity permanent access to it, and eliminate the species' need for warp travel. If you didn't know, the webway is kinda like a pocket dimension that exists between the physical and immaterial universes. It consists of a labyrinthian network of branching passageways that stretch across the entire galaxy. Warp travel is already ludicrously fast, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes even thousands of times the speed of light, depending upon the whims of the warp at any given moment. But it's also ludicrously dangerous. It's full of demonic predators and is subject to violent warp storms. The webway, on the other hand, relatively safe by comparison. Having access to such a thing would have ushered in a new golden age for humanity. But unfortunately, there was this whole Horus Heresy thing that happened, and the Emperor's plans came crashing down. In the 41st and 42nd millennia, the Golden Throne serves three main purposes. Number one, as I mentioned before, it's a ludicrously potent psychic amplification device, so the Emperor is able to use it to single-handedly hold back the tides of chaos. Now originally, he had a whole bunch of psychic wards around the solar system that prevented demonic incursions, but those ended up getting shattered by his son Magnus. So now the Emperor, through the use of the Golden Throne, has been holding the tides back for 10,000 years. The second purpose of the throne is that it is linked to the Astronomicon, and a portion of the Emperor's power keeps it lit. You can think of this thing like a giant golden beacon, an artificial North Star that produces a psychic light that navigators aboard void vessels can see from any place in the galaxy or from within the tides of the warp, thus allowing them to ground themselves and safely navigate in much the same way that sailors used to navigate the seas of old Earth. The third purpose, and the most well-known of them, is that it is a life support system for the Emperor. This was something that was done last minute during the Siege of Tera, as he had been mortally wounded by his son Horus. For all intents and purposes, it is the throne alone that is keeping the Emperor alive, and if it fails, he would surely die. And I should briefly mention, because I know someone's going to bring it up in the comment section, it's true that the Emperor is a perpetual, so if he did die, it's possible that he could reincarnate, but we don't really know how quickly that would happen, and in the amount of time it took, all of humanity could get wiped out. All of that gets into the realm of speculation, so we're going to stay focused on the core lore for now. As far as we know, if the throne actually failed, it would be beyond disastrous. Not only would the Emperor die, but that would mean that he wasn't holding back the tides of chaos anymore. Holy Terra would be consumed by hordes of demons in a matter of days. This would result in a massive upheaval throughout the Imperium as political instability spread like wildfire. To make matters even worse, this would also mean the Astronomicon would go out, making long-distance void travel impossible. All of the million worlds of the Imperium would be cut off from one another, just like they were during the Age of Strife, thus being easy prey for all of mankind's enemies. Now, the Emperor was a smart guy. He understood just how dire of a situation this would be. So he had his son Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, install a doomsday device into the throne, a dead man's switch, so to speak. If the device ever detected that the Emperor had flatlined, it would detonate and destroy Terra. So you can see why the idea that the throne possibly failing would not only be ludicrously alarming to anyone who found that out, but also they would do everything they could to cover it up. Likewise, said individuals may be willing to do some pretty horrible, heretical things in order to make sure this doomsday scenario never came to pass. And this is where the Vaults of Terra trilogy comes in. Now, like I said in the intro of this video, I'm going to be spoiling the absolute hell out of these books, as well as summarizing the main plot throughout the trilogy. Even if you watch this video all the way through to completion, I highly recommend checking these books out. The journey is well worth it, even if you know the destination. Okay, so the Vaults of Terra series follows two main characters, Erasmus Crowell and Interrogator Spinoza. You can kind of think of them like the grimdark equivalent of a buddy cop duo. You got your grizzled old veteran and your plucky newcomer. Except in this 40K version, the roles have been reversed. Crowell is a cynical old inquisitor who has gradually become disillusioned by Terra, the Imperium, and their role as inquisitors within it. This has led him to developing something of a loose interpretation of the rules, while also granting him a personality where he just doesn't really take things so seriously. He drinks, he cracks jokes, and at first glance, he seems like he may be leaning towards the radical side. Spinoza, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. She's stiff, rigid, overly formal, so much so that Crowell initially finds her quite off-putting. It's like she's fresh out of the Schola. She refuses to use his name, only referring to him as my lord, despite his insistence that she stops. She refuses to take a drink whenever he offers her one, as she always thinks it's some kind of test, even when he's just sitting there like, "For the love of God, you are insufferable. Please take a drink so I can stand to be around you." If you couldn't tell, I absolutely love these characters. The first book sees them investigating a supposed underground chaos cult, but near the end of the book, when they finally come face to face with its leader, they learn that this isn't a cult at all. It's an underground civilian militia formed from Terran civilians living in the underhives. They're being hunted by monsters in the dark, and no one is helping them. Not the Inquisition, not the Arbites, and not the Adeptus Terra. So they've armed themselves and are fighting back against the darkness. But these aren't just any regular old grimdark monsters. Oh no, they're what are known as grotesques, hulking abominations created by the Dark Eldar. The Inquisitors realize that if there's a bunch of grotesques loose in the underhives of Terra, then a Drukhari homunculi has to also be nearby. They fight their way to what is believed to be the homunculus's lair, and when they finally encounter the creature, it creates a sphere of dark energy around itself that obliterates all matter that it comes into contact with. It then starts to burrow through solid stone in the direction of the Golden Throne. Thankfully, they manage to stop it before it reaches its objectives. A custodian named Navrataran that is accompanying them, punching right through its refractor field, grabbing it by the neck, and then flinging it around like a rag doll, absolutely brutalizing it. But before he can deal the final blow, another Inquisitor who had been accompanying them reveals herself to be a traitor. Or at least, this is how it seems in the moment. She pulls a plasma pistol on the custodian at such close range that it would burrow through even his armor. She tells him to lower his weapon. The creature belonged to her. A huge fight ends up breaking out between the guardsmen that were following her and all of the custodians, and in the ensuing chaos, the homunculus manages to escape. She takes off after the homunculus, and Kral takes off after her. Eventually, he manages to catch up to them in an ancient chamber depicting the Emperor and the 20 Primarchs that is directly below the throne room. The renegade Inquisitor has incapacitated the homunculus, and she's got her gun pointed at it. Kral, on the other hand, has his trained on her and demands to know why she brought this thing here. She tells him that this conspiracy goes deeper than he could possibly imagine, all the way to the top. Despite how things looked, she was doing what she did for humanity. As impossible as it was to believe, the Golden Throne was failing. It had been failing for a long time, and despite the exhaustive efforts of the Imperium and the Adeptus Mechanicus's brightest minds, there was nothing they could do to fix it. The machine was too ancient, too complex, but the Eldari believed that they could help, and thus this creature had been brought here to inspect its faults and advise them. At one point in the conversation, she attempts to change target, bringing her gun to bear on him, but before she can, Kral puts a bullet in her forehead. It's in that moment that the homunculus attacks, having feigned being injured by the custodian. During the ensuing fight, their blood ends up mixing together, which will have ramifications later on in the story. Additionally, he tells him that he simply wanted to see the Emperor's face out of morbid curiosity before humanity went extinct. Kral demands to know who else was involved, who the other members of the conspiracy were, but before the homunculus can answer, a golden spear goes flying through the air and impales it. The rest of his retinue, including the custodian from before, had caught up to them. This is basically where the book comes to a close. The homunculus is killed, and we get an epilogue that ties up a few loose ends, while also confirming that Spinoza and Kral are still on the case. They had a lot of work to do to get to the bottom of this mystery. Likewise, the second book in the series is mostly focused around them tracking down the first of the 3 High Lords who gave the order to bring the homunculus to Terra. So we're going to jump ahead to the end of the third book, as that's where everything gets really spicy. Okay, we're skipping over a lot here, and due to events that happen earlier in the story, our group has been split up. But they end up reuniting near the end of the trilogy, along with a few newcomers. We've got Kral and Spinoza, as well as another Inquisitor named Zyges, and the custodian from the first book, Navrataran, along with the rest of their retinue. They all end up on Luna, where, as it turns out, there's an Eldari webway gate that has been activated. They make their way inside of the webway and eventually find out that there is a meeting taking place here between the Imperium and the Dark Eldar, overseen by an unnamed Archon on the Dark Eldar side, and on the Imperium's, it's helmed by Fabricator General of Mars, Raskian. They go to meet with the Fabricator General, demanding answers for what is going on. By the way, the Fabricator General is revealed to be like this tiny little dwarf machine that's vaguely in the shape of a person, but what he actually is a series of massive supercomputers that could fill an entire building, all linked together in this central human-shaped node, which makes so much sense for the Adeptus Mechanicus. He confirms that what the Renegade Inquisitor in the first book had said was true. The throne was failing, and in desperation, they had turned to the Dark Eldar for aid. This is exactly what he had to say.
Know this, if any solution existed, if any means of repair were available to us, we would have taken it. The greater part of my realm has been occupied with this one task for many mortal generations, sparing no expense of time or effort. And we have had at last to confront the truth. We cannot do it. We did not make it, and we do not understand it. So we have been forced, against our every inclination, to come to those who know more.
The party demands to know what the Fabricator General promised the Dark Eldar in exchange for their help, and it's revealed that their payment would come in the form of 9 planets. Planets that were currently under the protection of the Red Talons chapter of Space Marines. If the deal went through, that protection would be withdrawn, and the Dark Eldar could do what they wanted with them. 19 billion souls would be theirs to freely prey upon. Not only is this revolution absolutely revolting to the Inquisitors, but it doesn't make sense. They raided hundreds of worlds all of the time. Why would this be all they wanted? Despite their protest of this being wrong, Raskian tells them that it's a price they would have to pay. If the throne failed, they wouldn't just lose a handful of worlds, they would lose all of them. It would quite literally be the extinction of humanity. He tells them to understand this. The Xenos may be vile and contemptible, but they weren't fools. They knew that the Imperium of Man alone was what held the tides of unreality back. They would of course want to extract a price for their cooperation, as much for the sake of their pride as anything else, but they had no interest in seeing us eradicated. They were parasites. They were conscious of the requirement of a living host. If you don't know much about the Dark Eldar, what the Fabricator General is saying here is true. Their evolutionary path has made it so they do not derive substance from food and drink like we do, but instead from the psychic energy generated through extreme suffering. By inflicting suffering and pain on another living creature, they can drink in that essence and sustain themselves indefinitely. If they go too long without indulging in this, they become withered husks and will eventually die. Yet immediately after feeding, they become rejuvenated. They look younger, more muscular, more healthy. The higher the levels of suffering they inflict, the more energy they ingest. They're a despicable species of pseudo-psychic vampires, and working with them is unthinkable to the Inquisitors. Raskian admits that all of this is true, but he tells them that it doesn't matter. His calculations put the throne experiencing complete failure within a century. It had at best 100 years left, and at worst, a single decade. The detailed schematics of the throne's components had been given to the Eldari, but they had only been provided the exact amount of information they needed to ensure that they could fix the problem. One of the bigger takeaways of this exchange is that it wasn't something that all of the High Lords had agreed upon or even knew about. Early psychoanalysis done by Raskian showed that only 3 of them would agree to this plan. They would either be unwilling to accept reality or would refuse to work with the enemy. Consensus would never have been reached in time. Thus, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Master of the Astronomicon, and the Speaker of the Chartist Captains orchestrated this in secret and kept the throne's failing nature from getting out. Needless to say, this is a lot for our protagonist to take in. Just a few years ago, Spinoza would have decried the Fabricator General as a heretic for claiming that the throne wasn't built by the Emperor himself. But now, after everything they've learned, she doesn't know what to think. Krau, however, is not having any of this, and he demands Raskian shut this exchange down. The Fabricator General tells them that if they require proof, all of their acquired data on the throne gathered over the last several centuries would be made available to them here in this room. But ultimately, their feelings on the matter were irrelevant. Everything was proceeding to plan. They were in sight of an agreement. The Eldar would be able to assist them. The faulty components would be repaired, and they would be given the minimum payment necessary to save face. The Imperium would endure. The Omnissiah would be preserved for eternity. Now, after the meeting ends, the party debates amongst themselves what to do next. Krau is completely against this going forward. The Dark Eldar could not be trusted. There was something they weren't telling them. Everything was just too convenient. Giving them access to the Golden Throne would have major unforeseen consequences in the future. Likewise, the custodian of Radaran doesn't want to see this happen either, but he understands that ultimately, if it turns out the Fabricator General was being truthful with them, his allegiance was to the Emperor, and he would see the throne repaired. After this, Kral goes to meet with the Dark Eldar delegation, as they suspiciously have requested an audience with him. It turns out the homunculus from the first book is alive and well, having been regenerated from a single drop of blood. They have a pretty interesting back and forth, wherein the homunculus actually plays him a sample of Bach's music to mock him, showing him what humanity once was, how we used to create, and now we only cling to existence out of spite. Additionally, he reveals to him the nature of his resurrection, how his kind had mastered life and death, and from a single genetic sample, they could not only bring back the body, but also pluck its soul from the immaterium. He tells him that he had died many times in the past and would likely do so many times in the future. He says that he can't understand why the Inquisitor would be so resistant to this deal going through. Working with the Dark Eldar was their only option. If he only understood the truth of the throne, it would shatter his reality. It's neither here nor there, but I thought it was kind of an interesting detail. Throughout this story, Kral has been suffering from an unknown illness. He's been getting sicker and sicker, and after his encounter with the homunculus in the first book, it's been getting worse at an exponential rate. Likewise, he's kind of started to go insane. He's seeing the homunculus everywhere he looks, in every shadow and every reflection. He feels like he's inextricably linked to this creature. The homunculus explains that after their blood mixed together, they became linked in body, mind, and spirit. Kral, in a sense, is becoming part homunculus. Some time passes, and the Inquisitors, now talking amongst themselves, have decided they can't let this deal go through. They and their retinue would attack and sabotage the meeting if it came to that. But before they took such action, they wanted to infiltrate the Dark Eldar's side and see if they could find any evidence of what they were really planning. So they do just that, making their way through the webway towards the Dark Eldar's encampments. And in one of their buildings, they discover a strange mirror that the Dark Eldar can use to teleport long distances. Inquisitor Kral, now kind of sort of part Drukhari, is able to go inside of this thing. He tells his compatriots not to act until he returns, but ultimately, if he didn't make it back in time, to do whatever they had to make sure this deal fell apart. While he's in the mirror dimension, he ends up having a vision of Camorra in its present state. It's revealed to him that not only was the Dark City currently plagued by anarchy, suspiciously similar to what was happening on Tera after the opening of the Great Rift, but amongst the combatants were demons. Demons were pouring into Camorra, and despite everything the Drukhari had brought to bear against them, it wasn't enough. They could not stem the tide. This didn't make any sense to Kral. If they were under attack like this, why would they be wasting time helping the Imperium? If they were facing an extinction-level event, why was their price for cooperation simply a few more worlds to raid? None of it was adding up. There was something they wanted and they hadn't revealed it yet. The vision shifted, and he saw that they were building something massive in scale, a second Golden Throne. The warp had erupted under Camorra, and they needed a throne of their own in order to hold back unreality. It was then, with horrifying clarity, that Kral realized what they were actually after. They wanted the Emperor himself. Or more accurately, they wanted to clone him. The entire point of them offering their assistance was so that they could get close to the Emperor's body. All they would need was a single sample, a drop of blood, a strand of hair, hell, even just a couple of chromosomes, something scraped off of some old tools. And technically speaking, they didn't even need to get that close. The faulty components that the Imperium had broken off of the Golden Throne and provided them in exchange for new working parts very well could have trace amounts of the Emperor's DNA on them. That is all the master fleshcrafters of the Homunculi Covens would need to create a Dark Eldar version of the God Emperor. Such an inconceivably blasphemous creation could be used to launch horrors beyond imagining. Now, even if they weren't able to fully recreate him, even if the clone was simply a psychic vegetable, it would still have his blood coursing through its veins, and that's all they would need to power the Golden Throne. You have to remember that the Dark Eldar don't have any psychers, and although their Craftworld cousins do, none alive today even remotely come close to the Emperor in terms of psychic might. None amongst their kind were powerful enough to control another throne. Crow leaves the mirror dimension and intervenes in the exchange between the two parties in the last possible moment, revealing to everyone what actually was going on and what the Dark Eldar were really after. All hell ends up breaking loose, the deal falls apart, and both sides end up attacking each other. In the resulting chaos, the branch of the webway that they're in becomes unstable and starts to fall apart. Our party makes a mad dash to escape back out of the webway gate, and in the final moments of the final chapter, it's made kind of unclear if any of them made it out alive. In the epilogue, we're told that all of them are considered missing in action, and nobody's been able to get a hold of the Fabricator General of Mars in quite some time. Okay, so now you know everything that happens in the Vaults of Terra. Kinda sorta, I skipped over a lot to just get to the main talking points. But what are the implications of all this? What impact does it have on the future lore developments of 40K? Well, as it stands, everyone who had any knowledge of the thrones failing on the Imperium side was in the webway when that branch came crashing down. Now they're all either dead or at the very least missing in action. This means that the critically important message that the throne is about to fail and may only have a few decades of life left wasn't able to reach anyone. The only people who have any knowledge of it now are the Dark Eldar, and after this, they're probably not too keen on sharing that. Quick little side tangent, I'm not gonna lie to you, I both love and hate this ending. I love it because it's appropriately grimdark. It really hammers on the whole hopelessness that's supposed to be permeating throughout 40K. But on the other hand, it does the bullshit sitcom thing, where the story has to be reset at the end of every episode. The status quo can never change. So even though we just had an entire trilogy of really deep, thought-provoking material that is pushing the lore in an interesting new direction, the Black Library chickens out at the last moment and hits the reset button. But let's talk about the things they didn't reset. Komorra currently has demons flooding into it non-stop, and the Dark Eldar are in full panic mode. They've created a mirror copy of the Golden Throne based on the data they received from the Fabricator General, one that for all intents and purposes is shiny and new, not suffering the degradation of its components due to millennia of use like the real throne. They are attempting to clone the Emperor, but as of the end of the series, they don't have the genetic material they need in order to do this, and thus cannot power said throne. So here we have the two biggest things that captured the 40K community's imagination: a Dark Eldar clone of the Emperor and a dark version of the Golden Throne. Side note, I've also seen a lot of people calling it the Dark Throne. It doesn't ever refer to it as such in the book, but I admit that that's a pretty catchy name. When it comes to the cloned Emperor, I'm just gonna be honest, I don't foresee Black Library letting this actually happen. It's just an interesting reveal that it could, that the homunculi are skilled enough to do it. I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm getting a lot of flashbacks to Clonegrim from the Fabius Bile trilogy. Look at that, we have an uncorrupted clone of Fulgrim. I wonder what implications this is gonna have on— nah, never mind, he traded it away to Trazyn. Games Workshop in recent years has been pushing out more books than ever before, but they're also really conservative when it comes to their storytelling. I mean, can you even imagine what would happen if they attempted such a thing? First and foremost, they do not have the ability to dominate such a powerful warp entity. By all accounts, the Emperor's soul has been growing stronger in the warp ever since his entombment upon the Golden Throne. And by all calculations, he's most likely a god at this point. The Dark Eldar can't even bind lesser demons to their will, let alone a literal god being put into a physical vessel. They would lose control over him almost instantaneously and might end up dooming their entire species. Now don't get me wrong, I'm a big Dark Eldar fan, and the idea of them having an Emperor equivalent entity of their own is super spicy. But I just can't find a way to make a Dark Emperor like this that's loyal to the Drukhari of all factions work on any conceivable level that doesn't completely contradict 30 years worth of lore. If you can come up with a reason why this would make sense, then let me know about it in the comment section down below, because the idea on paper is pretty cool. However, when it comes to the idea that the Drukhari version of the Golden Throne is worthless without a clone of the Emperor, I'm not entirely convinced that that's true. And I could see this being a plotline that's explored in more detail in the future, namely because the Emperor was never intended to sit upon the throne himself. If you remember from the novel A Thousand Suns in the Horus Heresy series, it was originally his intention to have Magnus the Red sit on it. This most likely would have come to pass if the whole Horus heresy hadn't happened and completely derailed the Emperor's plans. And don't get me wrong, Magnus is a ludicrously powerful psyker, but he's nowhere even close to what the Emperor is capable of, even in his ascended demon form. Not to take anything away from Magnus, as he's definitely one of the most powerful psychers that has ever lived, but there are entities out there that are on his level, at least his Great Crusade version. Someone like Eldred, Farseer of the craft world of Ulthwé. Now I'm pretty confident this dude wouldn't willingly sign up for such a role. The Dark Eldar would probably have to kidnap him or use some underhanded methods to get him to agree to it. But at the end of the day, if it was either take control of the throne or see his species go extinct, it's very possible he could be convinced to do it. But what are your thoughts on all this? Do you think this Dark Throne, as the community has taken to calling it, is going to play a major role in future events? Who do you think the Dark Eldar would use to control it? Do you think they'll ever be successful in actually cloning the Emperor? What about the Golden Throne's ticking clock? How do you think this will end up being addressed in the future? On one hand, I want to say we would never get an end time situation in 40K, but that definitely happened in fantasy, so nothing's off the table. Let me know all of your thoughts, comments, corrections, and requests for future videos down in the comment section below. As always, big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.